Great. Well, good evening, everybody. As many of you know, my name is Trevor. I'm one of the pastors here at Risen Church West Side. It is so good to have you here on this Friday night for this very special event, an event we've been working on for a little bit, and we are just genuinely excited to be here together. I want uh, to talk a little bit about tonight's event and what that's going to be like. And I first want to begin by giving an introduction. In First Chronicles chapter 12, the scriptures tell of a group of people who are part of Issachar. And it says that those who are part of Issachar, the leaders of Issachar, that they discerned the times and that they made decisions based on a proper understanding of the times. And as Christians, we realize that there has been a tremendous amount of both information and misinformation in our culture today. And we want to respond to the challenges in the world as faithful Christians. We have an obligation to proclaim the good news of Jesus. We have an obligation to love God and our neighbor and to do that really well. And so we want to bring hope and healing, but that means that we are going to need clarity. And so we have invited Dr. George Yancey from Baylor University to be with us tonight, and we're very excited for his presentation and opportunity to engage with his work and to maybe think a little bit more clearly and a little more Christianly about some of the challenges that we are experiencing as a culture around issues of race. Let me give you a little idea of what the format is going to be tonight. And you all are muted, as you probably know. That's going to keep some of the chaos out of this meeting tonight. And so here's what you're going to do. George is going to present. I'm going to introduce him in just a second here, and then George is going to present. During his presentation, you are going to maybe find yourself with questions. Feel free to send those questions. You can type those questions out. And then when George is done presenting, I'm going to ask him a few questions, just a couple, to help land some of his material into our lives as a church. But then I'm going to sort of try to ask the questions that you have typed out. And so I'm going to try to summarize some of them and then be able to ask them to him. And he is going to be very generous with his time. He wants to get to as many questions as possible. So again, that's kind of our format tonight. It'll be a presentation, then I'll ask some questions, and then I'll ask him some questions that you all have submitted. So feel free to submit those during his presentation. Okay, before we begin tonight, I would like to open up in a word of prayer. So would you please join me in just praying that the Lord's hand would be on this gathering tonight. Heavenly Father, we recognize that your Spirit has brought about unity for us. And Lord, we don't need to create that unity. We need to help to work to make that unity come to life in different spaces and places and conversations. And so, Lord, we pray that your Spirit would draw us close together, that you would draw us deeper into knowledge, deeper into love, deeper into care for both one another and for our city. Lord, we pray that you would give us humility tonight. We ask that you would keep us humble, help us to think again about serving one another and to really be teachable, to be open to listening. Lord, I pray that you would help us learn, that we would grow through this moment together. Would you give us clarity, Lord? Would you give us clarity that we might be able to see things a little more clearly than we were when we began tonight? And lastly, Lord, would you give us an extra measure of charity? Would you help us to really love one another well? Would you help us to love our city well? And so, Lord, we cannot do this apart from your hand, apart from your Spirit, apart from your power. We thank you for Jesus. We recognize that here in this hall are just a lot of people who recognize we don't have it all figured out, and that we are sinners who are saved by grace alone. And we are so thankful for the grace you have offered to us in and through your Son. Be with us tonight, Lord, as we go into a difficult territory, but we do it with courage, Lord, because we long to understand, we long to learn so that we might serve you and our neighbors well. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. All right, everyone. Before Dr. Yancey gets started, I'd like to introduce him to you. After graduating from West Texas State University with a BS in economics, Dr. Yancey attended the University of Texas at Austin and received his doctorate in sociology in 1995. This may disappoint some of our OU crowd. He has worked with Dr. Michael Emerson on a $500,000 grant to study multiracial churches. Recently, Dr. Yancey has been studying academic bias and is researching anti-Christian attitudes in the United States. In 1999, George began teaching sociology at the University of North Texas. In 2019, last year, he began a new position at Baylor University with a joint appointment in sociology and Institute of Religious Studies. George has authored multiple books on topics including bias, media, race, and the church. He has also written a book that we have recently recommended to you, Beyond Racial Gridlock. He comes to us tonight as an African-American man, as a trained sociologist, and most importantly, as our brother in Christ. It is an honor to have Dr. Yancey with us here tonight. I will turn it over to him now.
How's everyone doing? Can you all hear me okay? Some thumbs up? Okay, great. All right, I would like to go ahead and, I want to share a PowerPoint with you all as I go through this talk. And so I'm gonna start setting it up. I come with a couple of premises. Premise number one, that on moral issues that our Christian church has something to say, something that should be unique. Oh wait, okay. Something that should be unique from what we're hearing from the rest of society. And if it's not, then it's shame on us. So that's the first premise that I have. My second premise, okay, here's how we do it. Okay. My second premise is this, that there really is not a distinction between good science and good theology. That when we do good theology, that it also turns out to be good science. So, all right, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
No, not yet. I don't think it's up yet.
Okay. All right. I apologize for this. This is the first time I've ever really have been doing this fancy stuff. Okay. All right, how's that?
George.
All right, good.
Yeah, it's up.
All right. My PhD is in sociology, it's not in technology. Just so y'all know that. Okay, so my premise is that really good science and good theology go together. Now sometimes it seems like they're saying different things, and usually it's either because the science is bad or the theology is bad. And you know, and that's what I believe, and I think time and time again I found that to be true. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present what I think is a Christian answer to the issues of race, racial alienation in our society. And I'm not just, I'm going to talk about why I think it's a Christian answer, why I think our faith opens up to this particular answer. I'm also going to support it with sociological research, so that, you know, when you think about these things, and I know that we don't have to say, all right, because science says so, we have to believe it, you know, but once again, I go back to, I think good science and good theology go together. And when the science supports theology, then we have all the more confidence that it is true and it's accurate. So anyways, is there a Christian solution for racial problems? What I contend is that we have generally secular solutions to racial problems. And what's happened usually is that Christians have adopted these secular solutions and you know, slap a Bible verse or two on them, and then say, "Hey, here's what our faith is saying." And I say, you know, have we carefully thought through the implications of our faith to see, you know, what would our faith really say about these sort of solutions? So let's first just look at what I would call secular solutions to these issues. I want to talk about models for dealing with racial conflict in America. And I'm going to, you know, just throw out these four models. First, colorblindness. And this is basically the notion that the best way to deal with race is to ignore race. You know, I don't see color, you know, that sort of attitude. And I'm not going to, you know, because of the time, you know, obviously this could be a 2 or 3 hour presentation, there's enough material for that. You don't have time for that. It's 2 hours difference here, or I don't have time for that. So I'm kind of giving short shift to these models, but I think you'll get a sense of what they're saying. Colorblindness, ignore race. Second, nonconformity. That if we help people of color to succeed in society, economically, educationally, that will deal with racial issues. That will help to alleviate racial tension. Multiculturalism. If you went to college, you heard about multiculturalism. That we're going to look at different cultures, and we're going to try to evaluate cultures of color and talk about how worthy they are, and not denigrate them and celebrate them. And then anti-racism. Now, in my original book that Trevor's recommended to you, I actually call this white responsibility. If I was to rewrite that book today, I would call it anti-racism. I actually use white responsibility because I couldn't think of a really good term, that people would automatically recognize. I actually had another saying for it, and the publisher says, that's too harsh. And I was calling it whites are evil response. But the publisher said, no, that's too hard. So I went to white responsibility. Today I would call it anti-racism. And so I'm going to call it anti-racism right now, as far as the fourth model. So these are the models that we see out there. Now, you will see secular versions of this model, and you'll see Christian versions of these models. And so let's look at these 4 models really quickly here. And I will point out, why I think that they fall short. First, let's look at colorblindness. Basically, colorblindness argues that we'll have racial harmony if we ignore race and forget the past historical discriminations. Concentrating the advances we've made and acting in a colorblind manner is the best way to overcome racism. So colorblindness, is when individuals say, don't see race. Why are you bringing up race? You who are bringing up race, you're creating the problems. If we just ignore race, treat race like it's hair color or eye color, something like that, then we can live in harmony. We don't have to deal with that. Well, here's the issue with colorblindness. It's a model that says that if we ignore race, then things will be better. But can we ignore the effects of race in our society? For example, our statistics support, you may have heard of this term called driving while black. And driving while black is when African Americans are more likely to be pulled over than European Americans, all other things being equal. So, your offense says you're black and you're driving, that's why driving while black. And there are stats that support that. When they've looked at certain highways, they've noted the racial makeup of the cars going past, and then they've noted how often people are pulled over. And lo and behold, African Americans are pulled over more. They've even noted how fast cars are going. And, black speed, but white speed, there's not much of a difference. In other words, if we want to say, let's just ignore race, we have to ignore the fact that African Americans are pulled over more than whites, all other things being equal. There's evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices of medical healthcare providers. This was a study that looked at several studies and found that 2/3 of the time in these studies, they found actual evidence of racism being practiced by medical healthcare providers. So once again, we can ignore race, but can we ignore, different ways we're treated in the medical healthcare position? Another, way society just is not colorblind. Black and Latino defendants are more likely than whites to be detained, receive custodial pleas, offers, and incarcerated after application of appropriate controls. And what we mean by appropriate controls is this is when you control for, because, when you hear this, people say, well, what sort of crimes they committed? Well, they control for that. What about this situation? Well, they control for these situations, and yet still, Black and Latino defendants are more likely to be detained, get plea offers, and incarcerated after all these controls, which is an indication that our criminal justice system is not colorblind. And this is research that I was fortunate to work on, almost 20 years ago, where we found that whites are hesitant to live in areas with increased Black populations, even independent effects of crime, housing values, and education quality. So even when told that crime is low, housing value is high, and education quality is good, whites still are hesitant to live in increasing Black populations. There are a lot of implications of our residential segregation. And we have residential segregation that has a pronounced effect on people of color. And we could talk about that more in the questions. I'll skip over that for right now. But there's a lot of research out there that shows that these sort of segregation does have a negative impact on people of color. So, you know, colorblindness says ignore race, and yet race still profoundly impacts the lives of people of color. Well, another model that's been offered is angle conformity. And this model encourages racial minorities to accept European American values. And the answer to racial strife according to angle conformity is to help minorities imitate how whites moved up the economic social ladder. So when you hear someone say something such as, well, you know, if those people would do this, this, and this, they'll succeed, and that's why they're lagging behind, this is a practice we would know as angle conformity. You know, if people of color pull themselves up by the bootstraps, you know, get married, get a good education, they succeed like everyone else. And so that's the attitude that some of the individuals have. And their idea is that will overcome our racial alienation. And there is some research that shows that as you have more economic equality, you have less racial tension. So there is some research along the ways that would seem to support that. So let's look at research on angle conformity. I mean, is this the model that we can use? Well, here's one, you know, here's just an issue that, if we're going to say, hey, just pull yourself by the bootstraps, we also have to deal with the reality. There's been no real decrease in racial discrimination in hiring over the past 25 years. And this is based on a series of studies, what we call meta-analysis. And what they do is they do, they'll submit applications to jobs, and some of the applications, clearly people are Black or Latino, and they're white, and they find racial discrimination. And this has occurred for the past 25 years. And I think that's important because we like to think that we have overcome racism in our society. And yet, for at least the past 25 years, we still see racism occurring in our society. To tell someone pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and yet you're going to have to face this sort of racism is part of what we're dealing with. Residential segregation still impacts the educational outcomes of people of color. We've looked at how, we talked about the segregation that's still there, that whites are less willing to move into neighborhoods with people of color, especially with African Americans. And we know that impacts people of color because it impacts the schools they go to. I don't know how it is in California, but in Texas, we have schools that are Black schools and schools that are white schools. It doesn't mean that every single person is white or Black, but they tend to be. And those schools vary in quality, and the schools that are Black and Latino, Latina, don't tend to be as good. And so at the very start, your education is impacted. And so if we want to say, hey, just get a good education, is it possible to go to a school that's not that good and get a good education? Yes, it is, but it's gonna be a lot harder. It's another hurdle you have to overcome that others don't have to overcome. And then this is an interesting study by Shapiro et al. On the racial wealth gap. We think about income a lot of times, how much money you make in a year, but there's also wealth. And wealth is, like your home, or if you have a retirement account or stocks. And we don't think about how our wealth really buttresses us. When things go bad, you got your wealth to fall back on. You lose your job, you got your wealth to fall back on. When you put your kids through college, you got your wealth to fall back on. And what they've noted is that even when you have equal incomes between Blacks and whites, the wealth gap is tremendously huge. So that whites come in with a lot more wealth than African Americans. And as you can imagine, having a wealth you can pass on to your kids. So if they get in trouble, you can help them out. That's just something that African Americans don't have to the same degree. So if we're saying, hey, just pull yourself up by the bootstrap, then we can all compete, it's not an equal contest. And that is an issue that we have to consider if we're looking at angle conformity. Okay, moving on. Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism deals with racial alienation by emphasizing the value and worth of minority cultures. Racial minority individuals and their subcultures are held in low esteem by the dominant society, And thus, we must find worth in those individuals and cultures. So the idea behind multiculturalism is, for the longest time, people of color have been told that, that they don't have much worth in themselves and their cultures. And even today, or a few days ago, I saw on Facebook someone talking about, the only thing African Americans have created was peanut butter. There's not much good has come from Black culture. Multiculturalism tries to correct that by saying, no, look at the value of these cultures, and even going to celebrate these different cultures. That is, what multiculturalism tries to offer us. And then, it has value in that there is a problem in the denigration of cultures of color. So that is an issue that's worth looking at. So there's no doubt about that. So what does our research, though, say about multiculturalism? Is this the solution that we've been looking for? Well, here's one of the things that we've seen, is that efforts at multiculturalism sometimes can be co-opted by forces that perpetrate racial oppression. In other words, if you take multiculturalism seriously, in its natural state, then if there are cultures that oppress other cultures, you have a hard time critiquing them, because the essence of multiculturalism is that we should value all these different cultures. And thus we must value not just what we see as good in cultures, but also things that we probably see as evil in cultures. Multiculturalism then can be co-opted by groups that would prefer to oppress. Taken to its logical conclusion, it becomes harder to outlaw criminal practices such as female genital mutilation under multiculturalism. This is building on the same point that logically, if we have to value all cultures, how do you say this is wrong without unfairly condemning another culture? Now, one may think that, well, all this is theoretical. But I think we're finding in a post modern situation that more and more it's harder to condemn practices that are dangerous or oppressive. This is just a little aside here. As a professor, I've read literature showing that students are trying to cheat more and more. And I'm not blaming this to regular multiculturalism, but there is more of an attitude that whatever is good for our culture, if culturally we feel like cheating is okay, why not? And so there are very real world implications to a multicultural approach that we have to be careful of. Another thing that multiculturalism problem has is that we've had diversity training, and based in in part in multiculturalism, in part in anti-racism, and so we've did research on diversity training. If we teach people to appreciate different cultures, will that reduce their prejudice? And we found that it has little long-term effect on prejudice. That doing diversity training, teaching people to appreciate different cultures, what you find, and this is a meta-analysis looking at a lot of different studies, is that you'll get a small improvement that goes away when you test it 6 months later. So in theory, multiculturalism sounds great. In reality, what it may be doing is reinforcing people who already appreciate different cultures, but not really changing the perspective of other individuals. And another issue is that multiculturalism works against having a common group identity. You go to your culture, I go to my culture, we appreciate all cultures. But we have found that having a common group identity actually increases positive feelings. That if you want me to feel more positive towards, say, the Hmong, that multiculturalism may not help that. But if I can somehow identify with the Hmong in some way, maybe we're all Americans, or if they're in Texas, hey, we're all Texans. Something like that actually increases my positive feelings towards them. So maybe the multiculturalism indirectly creates less positive feelings because it doesn't become a unifying force, and it's more of a separating force. So the reason that multiculturalism does not, multiculturalism holds some promise, but it doesn't appear to totally get there as far as a potential answer. And then, this is something that we are hearing a lot about today, anti-racism. D'Angelo's work on white fragility and how to be anti-racist, those books are 1 and 2 for the longest time, still may be. So we're hearing a lot about anti-racism. And so anti-racism, and really this is, there's under the saying there's nothing new under the sun. This is the definition I gave 15 years ago, 15 years ago in my book on white responsibility, and I think it fits anti-racism. They look at racial problems totally within majority group culture and individuals. Is that not what anti-racism does today? Racial minorities cannot be racist since they lack economic and social power of whites. Solutions revolve around total empowerment of racial minorities. I mean, honestly, I know that, it's not the most sophisticated definition of anti-racism. It doesn't have all the nuances, but I think this describes anti-racism today fairly well. And so, when we think about this new to anti-racism, it's really not that new. I was writing about this 15 years ago. I just didn't call it anti-racism because that wasn't the term that people were using. But this is not anything new that we've been seeing. So we can look to see what research has said about this sort of anti-racism. And one of the things is that anti-racism talks about implicit bias, that, we may not have overt bias, but we have this subconscious bias. But the tests of implicit bias are badly flawed. They really do not show, we can question whether or not we're actually get at implicit bias, but even if we are, they really do not show that implicit bias is connected to prejudice. So it may be that we do have this sort of hidden bias, but that's really not changing how we treat other individuals. And so correcting implicit bias, as some of the trainers of anti-racism claim to do, even if they are able to do that, and I question whether they can, it doesn't really make a difference in how people are going to treat each other. This is a study that came out last year, and I found it fascinating. One of the portions of anti-racism that people talk about is privilege, white privilege, things of this nature. So there've been a lot of teaching about privilege. And the idea is to teach about privilege and people become more sympathetic to people of color because they realize they don't enjoy the privilege that whites have. And that becomes, they become more open towards changing the way they look at things, they do things, so forth and so on. And yet this study shows that teaching about privilege does not create more sympathy for African Americans. But what it does do is create less sympathy for whites, especially for poor whites. Because when you teach people about how privileged whites are, and then you have a white who is poor, it becomes natural to think, well, if you're so privileged, how come you're so poor? It doesn't create more sympathy for blacks. It seems that people who already are sympathetic don't become more sympathetic, and people who are not sympathetic towards blacks don't become any more when you teach about privilege. What it does is it actually just creates less sympathy for whites. It may be that teaching about privilege overall just creates less sympathy for your fellow human beings. And anti-racism training can actually make some whites less willing to deal with racism. This is a study that I did on Christian college campuses. I looked at those that had anti-racism training, and it wasn't called that at the time, but it was basically the same thing. And basically what it showed was that whites who were exposed to it actually became less willing to want to deal with racism. They felt more put upon, and they actually withdrew more from wanting to deal with racism. So, the purpose of this is to create more sympathy for people of color. It really could be having a negative effect. So my argument is all these models fail. And now I'm gonna get a little bit, and I'm using research to show that these models just don't, they're not doing what we hope they would do. But now I want to talk a little bit about why I think that they fail. First, all these models tend to find some other group to blame. They all are targeting, colorblindness is targeting people who talk about race, and anti-racism targeting whites, and conformity is talking about targeting people of color who don't act, capitalistic enough. All these sort of things. They fail to recognize that human sin impacts us all. So while you're finding other people to blame, what's happening is that you're not looking at how human sin impacts not just them, but us, but you. A holistic Christian model was to harmonize all of us regardless of our failings. And so as I was thinking about this, that's why I was thinking about, what does my faith tell me about a holistic model that harmonizes us regardless of our failings? And really, the problem with all the models is that they do not take into consideration human depravity. They consider human depravity for some people, but not for all people. And I think what Christianity brings that is missing right now is an appreciation of human depravity. And when we appreciate it, I think it changes our perspective and helps us to create new models, which I think would be better suited for dealing with this, for dealing with the problems ahead. I'm just going to, I'm just going to go this really fast because I'm just going to suggest that there is a counter to human depravity, that's human perfectibility. I'm not going to go all into it, but just suggest that there are those who talk about human perfectibility, which is basically that humans become better with education. And that may be formal education, or that we educate you, we teach you how you can become more perfect. And humans are rational creatures that can convince to become better. So we are rational. We can, people who think this must not have small kids because they realize they're not that rational. But that's sort of the notion that we have. And the model we just use, if you just adopt our model, we get everyone on board with colorblindness or anti-racism or multiculturalism, they move towards in racial alienation. And that's the notion of human perfectibility. And if you all want to go more into, where this comes from, where it manifests itself, we can in the questions and answers, but I'm just saying that is a viable idea that is out there. Human depravity, though, goes in a different direction. We're inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. A colleague of mine, Michael Emerson, who I did the grant with, he published a paper with another colleague, not myself, showing that the more education whites have, the more likely they are to say that they would send their kids to schools that are racially integrated. And yet the more education they have, the less likely they are to actually send their kids to schools that are more educated, even after controlling for everything else. So education may not make us a better person, it just make us more clever in what we do. Only by accounting for our desire to protect our self-interest can we deal with group conflict. If we don't account for our own desire to protect our own self-interest, then we will not deal with the conflict in our society. Only by holding each other accountable can we find solutions for racial alienation. And my argument is that, how do you deal with human depravity? If I have human depravity, who's going to hold me accountable? Me? I'm the one that has human depravity. Other people have to hold me accountable. The best way this side of heaven to deal with human depravity is to be held accountable by other individuals. I'm going to go through this really fast because I'm with the time and I want to get some time for questions and answers. I think we've seen how human depravity does impact some of these models in a negative way. And so I'm just gonna put this up there real quick. If you all want to come back here on the videotape and write this down, you can. But I think that point is made. I want to use more time for questions and answers. So let's just look at the results of human depravity. Oftentimes, whites think people of color will play the race card in an unhealthy manner, but they will not openly discuss this out of fear of being labeled racist. So, whites look at people of color oftentimes and say, you're doing this, you're doing that. And rather than actually dealing with that, they don't want to be labeled racist, so they don't say anything. Does the racial problem go away? No, it doesn't go away. Because whites are looking at the human depravity they see in people of color. People of color do not trust whites to change our current unfair status quo. They see the human depravity in whites. They see how unfair our status quo is. I've not gone into institutional racism. Like I said, this could be a 3-hour lesson, if I went into all the different parts. But people of color are looking at this, but they don't always want to openly discuss it because they want labeled a whiner. You all just complain about race all the time. So we have this human depravity, it impacts us, and we don't do anything about it out of fear of being labeled in a negative way. We look at human depravity of other individuals, and without an accountability, we don't see it in ourselves. And I believe this is why we keep seeing a cycle of a racial incident, then a protest, and then a backlash, and then go back to normal, and then a racial incident, a protest, and a backlash, and back to normal. Because we're engaging in models, and yet we don't truly engage with each other to try to figure out solutions. And our human depravity that we see in others and not see in ourselves is a big part of why that's taking place. So we have a sin nature. A sin nature puts whites in a position to defend the status quo, whether it's just or not. You know, if you're white, the status quo tends to, has supported you in this society. There's a sin nature that is there. A sin nature puts minorities in a position to constantly criticize whites, whether they're right or not. There are times where we, people of color, we criticize whites, and we're right. There are other times in which we are manipulating whites. I mean, I've seen it happen. I'm just going to say straight out. There are times in which we manipulate us. So sin nature doesn't, none of us are free from our sin nature. Both groups do not have an incentive to care about the other group. If we're really honest, our sin nature takes us. Now, I'm not saying that we don't, all right? Understand. I think this is what our sin nature does to us. We have to fight against that to care about other groups. Because our sin nature, our natural sin nature, is to care about us and our group more than other groups. And so barriers are erected to keep racial groups separated. So all this has erected these barriers, and so we continue to go on. Now, we've made a lot of progress in race over the past hundreds of years. You know, we've gone from, totally dehumanizing people of color to Jim Crow type status, or leaving the Latinx population in the barrios, the Americans on reservations, to having legal and political equality, to, now racism is something people don't want to be. It's an ugly term. So we've made a lot of progress. And yet we still can't get past this barrier we've been at, can we? These barriers have still been erected where we don't trust each other, where they're still alienated, we're still fighting each other. And we think our younger, our kids are going to grow up, they're going to grow out of this, and they're going to overcome this. And we were talking about this 20 years ago. And here we are. We had a Black president, and we still have these barriers. And here we are. And it's our sin nature, I would argue, that keeps us in this sort of state. So, a mutual obligations approach. I've been talking about the problems, so let me spend a few minutes on what I see as a Christian approach. The Christian approach based on how we Christians can see the seed of the problem within our sin nature as we deal with our racial alienation in our society. I would argue that a mutual obligation approach is a Christian-based approach whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Because everybody has an obligation to work towards healthy interracial communication to solve the racial problem. When I talk about mutual obligations or mutual accountability approach, I sometimes use that. I'm not saying that we're going to find some sort of answer where we all have the exact same responsibility, the exact same task at hand. The history that we have of racial abuse probably means that our solution is not going to look that way. What I am saying is that we all have the responsibility to work to have a healthy interracial communication to solve our racial problems. To recognize that we start with ourselves, that we have the humility that we struggle with sin nature, and thus talking to others can hold us accountable so that we can see other ways of doing things and find a way in which we can find compromise and move together. And that's what I call a mutual obligations approach. You could also think about this as having collaborative conversations with one another. Conversations where we're not arguing, not the conversations we see on MSNBC or Fox or anything like that, where they're just basically shunning past each other. We're really working to find solutions and try to understand where others are coming from. And as a Christian, the effort to understand where others are coming from comes in part because I know I have blinders on, and that my sin nature blinds me to the needs and concerns others may have. Okay, so one of the components of doing this is what I would call active listening. So what I want to do is I want to first talk about active listening, and then I want to just so that you have something you could do after this. So this is not just all theoretical in your mind. Once I talk about active listening, I'm gonna give you like a little assignment that you can do to help prepare you for active listening. Because part of having this collaborative conversation, part of being able to work with others, to recognize our own shortcomings and to bring in information others bring us so that we can find a solution together, is to learn how to listen to folks. As a social scientist, sometimes when I do research, sometimes I do research a number crunch, but sometimes I actually go out and I interview people. One of my books was on atheists. And what I did was I and my research team went out and we interviewed about 50 atheists. I'm not an atheist, saved by the blood of the Lamb. So when I'm listening to atheists, I'm not listening to convince them. It's not an evangelistic type of thing. I'm listening so that I can understand where they come from, where I understand their perspective. Because I'm not writing a book on atheists to create a straw man of what atheism is and to attack it. I was writing an academic book on atheists as a way to understand atheism, understand what atheism is about, why people become atheists, why they stay atheists, things of this nature. To that end, I engaged in active listening. And the way I did this as a researcher is that I would ask questions, I would listen to the answers, I would do my best to frame what I just heard in terms that they would say, yes, you understand what I am saying. So, I would say, what I hear you saying is, duh, and then I frame it in the terms, and then they would either tell me, yeah, that's how I feel about it, or no, what you're missing is this, or what you're missing is that. That is what we call active listening. It's a very valuable talent for people who do interviews to have. We need to start learning how to actively listen. So listen to other individuals, not so that we can argue with them, but to understand where they're coming from, and so that we can then engage them on an honest level, rather than constantly arguing back and forth against them. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about active listening. It's a way of humbling, going before others to learn from them, to learn their perspectives, and so that we can see perhaps some of our blind spots. So that's what active listening is. Now here's a personal application I want you to consider doing. Your homework, if you will. Find someone you disagree with greatly on racial issues. It may be someone in your church, it may be a relative, it may be someone like this. Find someone you disagree greatly. The only thing caveat is, don't make it someone that you only see on social media, because then you really can't do what I'm asking you to do. Maybe a phone call or something like that, but it doesn't work well on social media. Let me just say it that way. Have lunch or coffee with them. Take them out to lunch or coffee or soda or beer or what have you. Have lunch or coffee with them. Listen to their perspective. Ask them about this issue. How do you feel about affirmative action? How do you feel about Black Lives Matter? How do you feel about people taking the knee? Listen to their perspective. Talk to them until they're satisfied you understand their perspective. What that means is what I did with the atheists. So you would ask them, okay, here's what I hear you saying. Put it in your own words. They'll either say, yes, you understand how I think about it, or no, here's what you are missing. And then they'll correct you. Let them correct you. And then after they correct you, they say, okay, now here's what I hear you saying. Talk to them till they, in other words, you're giving them the power to say, okay, you got it. Now, if they're willing to listen to you, fine. Otherwise, let it go. Don't go into this thinking, all right, I'm listening to you, but you better listen to me. That's not the spirit of this is. This is so you learn how to actually listen and learn the perspective of someone else. So otherwise, let it go. And finally, do not feel obligated to agree with them. I think one of the reasons why people don't actually listen is they think, well, if I'm listening respectfully to you, that means I agree with you, and I don't. That's fine. It is fine for you to disagree with people you're acting. In fact, I asked you to find someone you disagree with. If you're already agreeing with them, then you're not doing this at all. And this is not for them to convert you to their perspective. It's for you to understand theirs. So what does that exercise accomplish? It'll help us learn the perspectives of others. I think that's pretty clear. One of the things that we're missing is that we don't understand how other people think on these issues. And so we put them in the worst possible light. When in reality, we should be as generous as possible in our interpretations of how people feel about things. Just like we would want them to be generous with us, we should be generous with them. It'll help us learn how to actually listen. And by the way, obviously, this is a skill that is not limited to deal with racial issues. I know some of y'all are coupled up. Maybe a skill y'all could practice with each other. It's a skill learning on maybe with your kids, maybe with your friends. It's a very valuable skill to have. I wish I could say I do it all the time, but remember human depravity. I'm a fallen creature too. I don't always practice active listening the way that I should, but it is something that we can learn how to do and maybe do it more often. It'll also prepare us to communicate with others when the next racial crisis will occur, and it will occur. This is not the George Floyd killing is not the last racial crisis we're going to have, unfortunately. And wouldn't it be nice that the next time it happens that you knew how to listen to others, you knew their perspective. One of the things, when I do the interviews with the atheists, one of the things that started to happen is after about 10 or 15 interviews, I would ask a question and I wouldn't be able to know word for word, but I basically knew what the answer was going to be. Because I'd actually listened the first 14 times and the pattern had emerged and I kind of knew where the atheists were coming from. Wouldn't it be good the next time there's a racial crisis that you kind of know where the other person is coming from, even if they don't completely know where you're coming from? It creates a larger atmosphere that promotes useful interracial communication. What if we start creating an expectation that when there's a racial incident, instead of running immediately towards the worst possible interpretation of others, that we head immediately towards a useful interracial communication? Understand that we don't know everything, other perspectives, and maybe we can learn about that, and maybe then we can move on towards an attitude of compromise, a win-win, looking for win-win solutions instead of win-lose solutions. Solutions where I'll make sure you lose so I can win it all. Or towards a win-win solution, which sounds more Christian. I'm gonna make sure I win so you can lose it all, or let's all win together. This exercise I think can really help prepare us to do a mutual accountability, because it'll teach us how to learn the perspectives of others and to move forward in that. Okay, so let me just real briefly talk about, all right, that's good on an individual level. Could we actually use this to solve larger problems in our society or issues in the church? Maybe there's an issue in the church that's brought up as far as, how people of certain races feel or something like that. And I would argue, yes, we can use this, we can develop the tools we need to solve larger problems. And indeed, we talked about in some of my writings steps on how you would do that. And you have to know how to actually listen for this to work. But here's how we could do it. First, we could define the racial problem. So if we're looking at, how do we deal with police in racial communities, or how do we deal with, literature that we're going to teach in our public schools on racial issues, or how do we deal with hate crimes legislation, or how do we deal with immigration reform? Okay, find the racial problem, define the racial problem. Know that this is the problem we're going to work on. We're not going to deal with everything at once. That's why we get nothing done. And you know this. If you've been in any sort of friendship, romantic relationship, whatever, you try to solve everything at once, you solve nothing. So focus in on a problem. and deal with that issue first. And then identify the critical core. And what I mean by this is, what is the critical element that we have in common, that we share with one another, that we can go and, okay, you know, we may not agree with this, but we do agree here. Is there a common goal that we want? You know, what is this core that's critical that we have in common? We sometimes deal so much with how we disagree that we don't even stop and think about, well, we do agree on this. Recognize, though, the cultural and racial differences at play. And so we do take seriously the fact that, you know, there are some differences here. You know, you see this, I see that. You know, there's some real differences here that we have to investigate. And so recognize the cultural and racial differences at play. Develop ideas that address the concerns of racial outgroups. So once you recognize this, and here's where listening is important. So you recognize the differences, you engage in active listening, so you know where other people are coming from. And so as you try to solve the problem, you're going to solve the problem that meets the needs of your group. You should also, as you try to solve the problem, as you think about ideas, also think about, but they also need this. So how can my solution help them as well as me? Human depravity means that probably your solution is going to meet your needs better than their needs. But we got to start thinking about how we meet the needs of other individuals and not just our own. If we don't, given human nature, given human depravity, we'll be dragged towards that selfish desire to meet our needs and neglect the needs of others. So if you have, you know, a white group and a non-white group trying to discuss some issue, and whites have certain needs, non-whites have certain needs, as they try to develop ideas on their own, both should be developing ideas that are closer to each other because they're trying to meet the needs of other individuals rather than just developing ideas that meet the needs that they have. And I think if we do that, it becomes easier, not easy, but easier to working towards a solution that can be accepted by all. And here's one of the things, because sometimes when I present this, sometimes some people of color go, well, you know, look at all the unfairness this is, and we've undergone, and we need to have this change and that change. And what I say is, look, you know, you can push forward, and maybe you can win politically temporarily until you get the next president or what have you. And, you know, maybe you'll get 100% what you want, but it will not be stable because 40% of the population will sabotage it. What if you get 70 or 80% what you want, and 78% of the population say, hey, let's work together towards a solution? What you have there is a stable, sustainable solution. And, you know, I guess this translates into also our political situation where one party tries to get a solution and the other party does everything they can to torpedo it, and thus it's not sustainable, rather than working together for a solution we can all work on. Wouldn't it be better to get 78% of the things that you want the most, because that's what you're going to negotiate for, right? You're going to let go of things that it's not as important to you. And that is what you have everyone working towards, not just people who are on your team, if you want to think about it that way, but on the other team as well. So it is important that we get a solution. Of course, I'm not talking about every single person in the United States, but where you have people working across different racial groups and different political perspectives to solve the problem. That, I would argue, is a Christian approach to solving problems. We try to include everyone instead of trying to impose a solution of human perfectibility upon all. And with that, I will turn this over to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yancey. I so appreciate your approach and the care that you have put into this. I know that you wrote this book a while back and have been working on some other projects, and this one has become incredibly relevant for you recently. I want to ask you a few questions that I think will be helpful, and then I'll kind of begin to ask some questions from those who are in the church, and their great questions have come in as I'm looking through them. The first thing that comes to mind is, I know you've written a more popular level book and a more academic level book on this. How have non-Christians responded to this model, this solution, right? It seems to me that grounding something in the doctrine of human depravity is going to get some pushback from those who are not Christian. So how has your work been received by those who are not Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been respectfully received, honestly, because, the notions of anti-racism has been so dominant. It's been by and large ignored. I'm hopeful though, because of late, at least my Christian book has gotten a lot of attention. And so there may be an opening for Christians to champion a different approach. I think a superior approach. And in a post-Christian world, I think that would be very important. And I've not talked about this, but some of my research is on, anti-Christian bias, and in a post-Christian world. And so, if we're going to retain a level of respect and a level of how do I put it, a level of influence in our society, that we're going to have to earn it. And one of the ways we can earn it is by presenting a model of racial that deals with racial alienation that is truly going to deal with it, rather than recycle the same failures that we have again and again and again. People will have more respect for the church if we had real interracial conversations within the church, and we had people across the racial spectrum really engaging in a way of finding real solutions. That's not going to end the post-racial reality, but it would help put us in a better position to endure it. And so I think that is something of value that we can gain. As far as something that would help the world stand up and take notice of the Christian church in a very good way, if we were to engage in that. I honestly don't expect a lot of, until we in the church do this a lot, I don't expect a lot in secular society to embrace this model, even though the research shows that collaborative communication is superior to diversity training and actually changing people's attitudes, simply because of human depravity. The dynamics I talked about earlier. If you're not a Christian and recognizing it's a problem in the first place, then your chances of actually confronting it is almost nil. So I don't expect a lot of people in the secular world to actually embrace this. I did work on that book with Michael Emerson to write it, because I anticipated that one criticism would be, well, this is just a Christian thing and there's no basis for this beyond your Christian beliefs. And wrote the book, an academic book, to show, no, this is not just a Christian thing, that research does show that this is probably a better way of going about it. And so I'm happy for that book, and people want to buy that book. It's not written in a heavily academic way, but it doesn't have scripture, it doesn't bring up depravity or any biblical errors like that. That's fine, all well and good. But yeah, I think that until the church starts doing this, it's not going to be done in the rest of society.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I know that, Dr. Emerson wrote this book, Divided by Faith, which is a fantastic work. You guys have partnered on a book. You've got a lot of experience looking at and working with churches that have been multiracial. How does a church, or what kinds of, I know that we've talked about some personal practices, which are obviously incredibly important. It's one of the, as I was listening to you, I kept thinking, our many of the people in our church have very strong opinions about this, but and I know that they have strong opinions about this, but they don't necessarily know that each other has strong opinions about this. So the importance of creating dialogue with one another, I think, is incredibly important. But I've been thinking about how do churches move from sort of short-term acknowledgement of some of these problems to making a long-term difference. And so what kinds of things have you seen churches do that you've gone, that's really good kind of collective work to make a difference in this area?
Historically, we could see some interesting examples, something like the Quania Farms, where, this is like back in the 60s, I believe, where you had, and this is a radical idea in the 60s, you might well imagine, which were interracial farms, Christian-based, where people were working together in community, and so we've seen historically at times Christians coming together in a racial, in a racial setting, and oftentimes what happens is they learn how to communicate with one another, and they learn how to work through their issues and their problems, and it's a sparkling witness. Are there churches doing that today? Yes, not as much as there should be, given the number of churches we have, and given the fact that we actually have seen an increase in multiracial churches over the past 20 years when I first started studying it. But we should see more dialogue. You know, I would suggest that one of the things a church could do to get, depending on the situation it's at, is enter into an internal dialogue, interracial dialogue itself. Are there issues people can bring up to learn how to discuss these issues, and so that when there is the next racial crisis that comes along, members of the church can get together and discuss and move together as a church, presenting solutions that perhaps people have not thought about, because they actually are solutions that take into consideration the interests of everybody. And so I do think that it's too late really for a church now to say, hey, let's have this dialogue so we can talk about the George Floyd situation. I think that dialogue takes some time, and obviously, we're now 2 months past George Floyd, and I think that we're in the stage of counter protest right now, backlash right now, and so I don't know if the church can really speak to George Floyd's situation right now, but there's going to be something else. So now would be a good time to start having those some honest conversations, with some ground rules, with efforts to try to understand where others are coming from, and to move forward in that direction. I think that would be a value at this point. Now, if a church has already done that, if a church is already engaged in those sort of conversations, then perhaps they could start going into the larger community and bearing a witness to, here's our church statement of how we see things, in consultation with each other. And we don't all agree. Some of us have come from more of a colorblindness type of perspective. Other of us come from more anti-racist perspective. And yet we're seeing how we can pull together to find solutions that can meet the needs across the spectrum. And I think that would be a very powerful witness if we saw more and more churches start doing that sort of stuff. But that's going to take some work. It's going to take some time. And this is not just snap your fingers and it's going to happen instantly. And sometimes I think we try to rush solutions so fast because we go, and let's just do this and then it's solved. And then we get solutions that are half baked and or just look like the rest of the world. So that's where I would like to see churches go more and more often at this stage, and until we have more and more churches that have really worked through some mutual accountability approaches to move forward on.
Yeah, I know as a church, one of the things that after George Floyd was killed, we as a church, we weren't able to respond as quickly as I wanted to, and in our response, one of the things that I sort of lamented, I confessed and acknowledged, was that we had not prepared our church to think Christianly about how to deal with issues like this. And I recognized that the whole incident for me was a catalyst for recognizing that we're sort of behind the 8 ball, and that we have kind of work to do in the future in order to help our people think a bit more like Christians. And our dialogue with you tonight is certainly a part of that. And so I'm really grateful for you taking time. I want to turn over to some of the questions that have come in from people. We've got some really great questions. I want to ask, the first one I want to ask is from one of our elders, Matt. And here's what Matt says. He says that in Kendi's book, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, Kendi defines racial inequality as, quote, when 2 or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing, end quote. Kendi defines anti-racism as opposing any system that puts people on unequal footing unjustly. He does not locate racial problems solely within majority group culture, but in unjust systems that make use of race to perpetuate inequality. Is he wrong? And if so, why is he wrong?
Well, the thing with Kendi is when he critiques people of color, he still is criticizing majority group culture. And so I would argue that, that Kinney really doesn't deal with human depravity within majority group culture. In fact, when he says, he does something that is a little bit different from other anti-racists. He says that, yeah, blacks can be racist, but then the way he describes the way blacks are racist is if they are not sufficiently anti-racist. And so in a sense, what Kinney is arguing is that, if he's really working off the human perfectibility model. If you do, how to be anti-racist, if you do this, and if everyone does this, then we have an anti-racist society, and then we solve, the problem of racism. And Kinney doesn't, limit to race. True. So for him, the solution is not just how we typically think of not being racist, but also, how do you feel about capitalism? How do you feel about sexual minorities? How do you feel, on gender? And so it's a really all-inclusive worldview that he has, and that he says, this is the way it should be, and to be anti-racist, this is the way you need to be. I think there's all sorts of implications. I'm less interested in critiquing all those things. I think there are critiques about those things. I'm more interested in this sort of methodology that he's using, which is, I think directly tied to to the whole notion that the way to solve, racism in the United States is to get people who disagree with me to comply with me, rather than to work with those folks to see where we can find common ground. I don't see in Kinney's work, and so I could point it out, then I could change my mind on this, a real effort to try to understand people who disagree with him, to work it out. And by that, I'm not saying that by that you have to say, oh, you disagree with me, therefore we have to do what you want. But what I'm saying is that, unless we think that we have the answer, and that, that there should be a modicum of humility of knowing, I was thinking, we could be wrong. And so it's worth it to listen to others so that we can grow together. I don't see that in his writing. Once again, I'm willing for it to be pointed out that is somewhere in his writing, but I did not see that when I went through his book. So I would think that is the issue, and I think that's the level in which we Christians have to start thinking about. Yes, we can critique, Kinney's socialism or things of this nature, but that's really less important than looking at how we approach issues of depravity and humility and moving forward in those ways. Because if you're wrong on the on whether or not there's the right economic system or how or how we do sexuality or anything like that, if you're wrong on that, that can be corrected if we are accountable to one another. If you're wrong on not making yourself accountable and learn from others, then then that cannot be corrected by trying to get these other issues correct. The core issue is our willingness to learn and to grow and to work together to find compromise, to find win-win solutions. I think that's more core than other critiques. By the way, I'll just go ahead and say this about Black Lives Matter. I've gone onto the website Black Lives Matter. I've read some of the stuff they said. I'd agree with everything that's on their website. I think Christians make a mistake by going to the website saying, look, they wrote this, and criticizing them on that level. The criticism of Black Lives Matter, once again, should be on their methodology of enforcing a certain perspective on all our individuals. And I remember getting discussions with individuals who are very supportive of Black Lives Matter, and what they say is, Black Lives Matter is not trying to solve all problems. It's like, they're trying to solve cancer, they're not trying to solve all health issues. And that's the example they give. So that's why they're focused on police shootings and not on black crime and that sort of stuff. And that's fair enough. Until several years, about 4 years ago, when we saw that Black Lives Matter was not just bring up their issues, they were going to places, and the most famous case was the Bernie Sanders political rally, where they basically took over that rally. And you may or may not have known, you can Google that, Bernie Sanders rally, Black Lives Matter. They basically took over that rally. You can't say that what Black Lives Matter wants to do is focus in on a issue and then take over a rally of someone who will talk about different issues. What they essentially did was, instead of saying, look, we want to focus on cancer, we're not trying to solve all the health issues, we're just trying to do cancer. They went to someone who's saying, I want to solve all the health issues, and said, you just talk about cancer. Now, this is saying nothing about whether or not I agree with Bernie Sanders or not. I'm just saying that their methodology, if you look at what they do and not what they say, really is one of, we're going to impose this solution on everyone. That methodology is the main problem, because that is the core issue that prevents them from finding a solution that brings people in. And thus Black Lives Matter becomes a way that, in order to be in compliance, you have to capitulate to them. And if we're asking people to capitulate to us and not be challenged by them at all, I think that becomes an unchristian way to approach racial issues.
You mentioned earlier in your last answer a little bit about the sort of power dynamics that exist. One of the questions we got from our sister Emily Bell, she says, how would you respond to a critique that the mutual obligation model ignores racial oppression and power imbalances? How do we balance active listening and calling out injustices? Also, do you think that the realm of racial issues that those who are oppressed have in the realm of racial issues, that those who are oppressed should have a more important or valuable voice?
Okay, very good question. Here's the thing. Nothing in the mutual obligation approach prevents you from calling out oppression or calling out anything. In fact, you have the ear of someone else, and their job is to actually listen to you. That's their job. Now, you have a job too. Their job is actually listening to you. I would even argue that you have a better chance, and research shows you have a better chance of convincing them that oppression is a problem if when they're in a position where they are supposed to actually listen to you, than when you're in a position where you have the diversity trainer who in that situation does have power over them and basically is trying to browbeat the reality of oppression into them. So if we really want to deal with oppression, the best chance to gain allies is to get them in a position to where they actually listen to you. And when you listen to them, you will learn how to talk to them in ways that may actually convince them. I'll give you an example of this. And I didn't go into it, but institutional racism is reality. Okay, so and we can talk about that. If someone has a question about that, I'll give examples about that. That's all well and good. It's a reality. So it pains me when people are talking about institutional racism and they get on a show and how they describe it. They describe it as white supremacy. Now, when you say white supremacy, what I already know what images come in the minds of people who don't accept institutional racism. They see white supremacy as the Klan. And what they will do, because I've had these conversations, or I've listened to them, they'll think, I am not the Klan. I love Black people. I love I have friends who are Black, all this sort of, and you may say, well, that's not the point. But you have just signaled to them that you're calling them a racist. And now they're gonna be in defensive mode, and your chance of convincing them about institutional racism just went down the toilet. Out of listening, yes, there's a compromise that I'm asking. And I'll get back to the power imbalance on the compromise in a second here. Compromise I'm asking. But what you're gonna gain is you're gonna gain the ability to know how to talk to people in ways they can actually listen to you. We can either, I've come to realize we can either try to convince people, try to convince them of our way, or we can get a good zinger in there and insult them and get attaboys from people who already agree with us. That's the choice. That's the choice we have. You get that zinger in there, you're gonna get those attaboys, but people are not, the people you want to convince are not gonna listen to you. Now, power and balance. Yeah, there are dynamics in that. And if we do active listening well, when we get in the room, we all have the platform and we all engage. And that's the meaning by mutual. I think once we do that we're gonna find that the solutions we generate are gonna be solutions that are gonna favor people of color more than favor whites. They're not gonna be everything people of color want. And you know what? They shouldn't be. Because some people of color want things that are not fair. And that's just reality. That's just human depravity. You know, some people of color want things that quite simply are not, is not what we would consider, is not really realistically justice. It's revenge. And we've seen this, in Africa, sometimes when after having their foot on their necks and the Africans trying to get free from the colonizers, the retribution they do, is not in proportion to what people have done to the people, the people who suffer it. They suffer more than they deserve. And we've seen some horrible things happen over there. And so we just have to recognize that. So what we have to do then is engage in this. And I think the solutions actually are going to be those that do bring more balance. But to get there, you got to get buy-in. And to get there, things that perhaps are less important to individuals, things that may be more about revenge than justice, are going to be, we have to let some of that go. And I think that is the way that we can get there. One last thing about, justice. We have to be careful of thinking that, that the way we're going to get there is simply to empower people who've been victimized. This is just a sad reality, but I mean, we've seen it in study after study, that people who've been victimized can go on to victimize others. Research has shown that people who've been abused grow up and are more likely to abuse others the way that they've been abused. So, we can feel for people who've been victimized, and we should do what we can to bring them into the conversation. But, and this is just something I just have to say, there's a difference between listening to them with compassion and listening and then doing what they want without question. And what I tell people is, if you want me to listen to you because you've been victimized and you need a listening ear, then yes, the degree that I can, if we have this sort of relationship, I will do that. And I'm not going to say, here's what you should do, because I'm listening to you with compassion. If a woman has been abused, I'm going to listen to why, with compassion. I'm not going to say, why did you, I'm going to listen to her. But if she tells me, help me to overturn laws against due process so the people on my abuser can't get away with it, I have to be convinced. I deserve to be convinced, to have agency to be convinced of that, because that has all sorts of ramifications that can impact me. And I had to bring this up, especially as an African American, we have a history where denial of due process has led to all sorts of horrors for people like me. So I can't just say, because this has happened to you, I'm going to do what you asked me to do. At the point where you asked me to actually do something tangible like that and not just listen with compassion, I have a right to engage in that conversation. I don't give it my agency to engage in that sort of conversation. And so sometimes I do think whites need to just listen with compassion, but I think that we people of color have to understand that if we're going to ask them to support this law, this rule, they have a right to engage in that conversation as well. And then together we can find hopefully a path that can meet, at least most of our needs. And I think we're going to meet a lot more of our needs than we think if we're willing to work together.
Great. Our next question comes from our brother Jason Sway. He says that your argument or your model, your solution advocates for kind of an incremental approach in terms of addressing racial change. But he says in this country, the largest and most persistent changes have come in spurts and in the midst of violence and upheaval. Think here of the Civil War leading to abolition, the 60s race riots leading to the Civil Rights Act. And he says, in between, the incrementalist approach has led to a consolidation of systemic racial systems. So why should we hope for a different outcome this time using incrementalism?
Actually, I would disagree with that. That what research has shown is that when you have rise in violence, you actually have more resistance towards racial efforts. And so upheaval actually isn't as productive as people think that it is. And if you really want to think about it, you know, you had, for example, you had the 60s and you had all the stuff that happened. And what happened right after the 60s is you had the Reagan Revolution. And so, you know, well, that was the 60s, but you had the 70s, and that, you know, and there was a lot of backlash that happened in that, and that led to the Reagan Revolution. And then if you want to look at the Reagan Revolution, which started in 1980s and on, attitudes, you know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the 1980s, where things such as interracial relationships, more romantic relationships, were really looked down upon, overtly so, in ways that was not the case today. You actually begin to see, you know, after you have the initial backlash, you know, movements towards acceptance just sort of grow over time, to where today, I tell this story. You know, I had a friend in graduate school, and this was back in the 1990s. And you know, and we were friends, and we were never romantically involved. She was white, and she told me, you know, I could never be romantically involved with you because my father would disown me, and I didn't care, you know, I wasn't interested in her, but that was an interesting comment. Well, I got with her a few years ago, and she said that her son was having problems because what had happened was people were targeting him as a racist because there was a rumor he wouldn't date a woman because a girl, her son was in high school, a girl because she was Black. And so what, you know, we had to change over time, you know, and this is from the 90s to today, where we hadn't had a revolution, to where our attitudes had changed to where it was, you know, it was looked down upon to actually interracially date, to where it's looked down upon to not be interracially date. Now, where is the revolution that changed that sort of attitude? And that has all sorts of implications that happen. You know, the willingness to interracially date, to be with, you know, the sort of barriers that come down over that, you know, that has all sorts of very important implications. That changed in a situation where we weren't having these wild revolutions, but what was happening was people were getting in contact with one another, and people were working together, and people, you know, and we were overcoming some of the stereotypes and barriers that were there. And so, whereas, you know, did you get some laws and rules from the 60s? You got some, but you also got a lot of resistance and a backlash. Are you going to get some rules from the current rights? You know, you might get some, but you know, the backlash is already beginning, you know, against that. I don't think you're going to get the sort of long-term systematic change from these sort of riots that people hope it would get. I think what's more likely to happen is that maybe, you know, what the best we can hope for in some of what's happened is that some people will take things more seriously, and we'll begin the longer term process where we'll see that sea change. But yeah, I just don't buy the premise that, you know, that engaging in that sort of activism actually is the catalyst to producing change. I think what I described, the longer term change, where people just over time begin to change their perspectives and attitudes through interaction and communication, that is really where the benefit will go.
This next question is from Sam and Leandra Prince. And they say that in your book, you talk a lot about how racism takes more subtle forms today, and that many people still see it as something that, you know, is sort of superficial examples like, you know, not using the N-word. How does the church do a better job of defining or thinking about the subtleties of racism or subtle racism? Because without a clear definition, people might not think they have a problem. And if people fail to realize that they struggle with the sin of it, then how can they repent? So how do we talk about subtle racism?
Yeah, you know, I think that one of the problems we have in the church is that we focus in on individual sins and personal sins, and as well, you know, we should talk about that. Obviously, you know, we need to talk about us dealing with our own personal sins, but we don't talk enough about institutional sins. And I think the Bible does talk about institutional sins. I think the Bible, I truly believe the Bible teaches about institutional sins. I think it goes to some of the Old Testament talking about, you know, taking care of the widows and things of this nature. I think you go to Nehemiah, where Nehemiah talks about how we have sinned. Daniel talks about how we have sinned, an institutional type of sin. You know, I think that if the church talked more about institutional sins in general, it'll be easier then to go and talk about institutional sins when it comes to racial issues. I think because we've not talked about institutional sins in general, institutional problems in general, it becomes easier to ignore those issues. Now, as far as examples, I think that there are some good resources out there. Just not as much in Christian literature, although there is some, but in sociological literature on how our institutions perpetuate our social problems. And so, one of the books that I like to recommend, even though at points is a little bit of a hard read, but not, I think mostly it's a good read, is American Apartheid by Massey and Denton, where they look at residential segregation and the pernicious effects of residential segregation, how it's developed and how it continues to plague us in our society. They talk about hyper-segregation. And let me just go ahead and do this, because I've heard that, those of us who talk about institutional racism, we never define it, and thus it can mean a lot of different things. I define institutional racism as when there are unfair effects on people of color by our institutions, regardless of whether or not the person is personally racist. So Jim Crow was institutional racism, regardless if you were, whether you were racist or not, you're in the institution that had pernicious effects. One critique of this has been, there may be things that are good but have an unequal impact on people. For example, there may be, it may be that people of color commit a certain crime more so than others, and so by having that criminal law, we would have, you could say that's institutional racism. And I'd say that, that's fair to say. And so there may be things that have a disproportionate impact that we have to, that we don't want this crime, maybe, I heard that burglary is such a crime. I'm not sure, but I'm not a criminologist. But, that's fair. But I think a lot of what we talk about is institutional racism. A lot of the mechanisms that we're looking at don't fit into that sort of category. It's not so obvious that this is a good thing to have. And so thinking along those lines is something that, as thinking individuals, we should engage in as Christians, as far as changing our society and trying to deal with structures. One last thing. One of the reasons why this developed this way is if you go back, and this, excuse me, this sounds a little academic-y, but it is what it is. My wife says, I'm a nerd, so I am. Back in the early 1900s, you had the modernist fundamentalist schism. And what happened was, some Christians called fundamentalists, and they called themselves fundamentalists, that a book called The Fundamentals. They focused in on soul winning and that sort of stuff. Others, modernists, started focusing on what they call the social gospel, dealing with that. Somehow, before that, Christians did both. They engaged in winning people to Christ, and they engaged in confronting the problems of our society. That schism somehow made it seem like, well, you either do one or the other. And I don't think it has to be that way. I think we can do both. I think we can be concerned about witnessing and telling other people about Christ and living outside of personal life and having moral values, not falling into our culture and those moral values, and wanting to address the institutional problems that are there. I think we can do both. And I think that what we should be striving for is to bring us back together from that schism that happened in the early 1900s.
Kind of picking up on what you're talking about here, our sister Alex Beal, she talks about how you mentioned in your book corporate repentance, and as a culture, right, as a country right now, we're asking questions about what does it look like to practice corporate atonement. And you had you mentioned in your book that you think reparations are a bad idea, but how do we as a nation, she asks, completely atone for the sins of the past?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'll admit that since I've written that book, I have kind of, I won't say that I've moved away from corporate repentance. I don't emphasize as much, in part because I've kind of realized that what that looks like is a part of what we need to discuss. That, even if I have the correct, right answer for corporate repentance, if I try to impose it on folks, then it's not going to work. And so I think we need to have a discussion. What does that really look like? So I'm not going to be able to give you, this concrete, here's what I think corporate repentance looks like. I think that I've sort of backed away from defining it. I think it's something that we really need to discuss what that is in a Christian sense. But what I will say is that, we have to recognize that that we didn't get here by accident, that we have a history here, that, that people of color have been victimized historically, and that victimization does impact us into today. It does not ensure how we live our lives, but it has a big impact on how we live our lives. And so, what are we going to do about these sort of sins? And as Christians, the way we do handle sins is we repent of them. What does that look like? How do we engage in that sort of repentance? I don't think reparations, now if in conversations we decide reparations is the way to go, then that's fine. But I think the way that we've taught about reparations is, someone will try to pass a bill about reparations or say, by golly, you have to have reparations. I think that that's a disaster waiting to happen. If someone imposes reparations in our society, that's a tinderbox. And if that ever happens, what you're going to find is a lot of whites are going to say, well, you all got your money, go away. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And so the communication just dies. And so, I'm not opposed to reparations under any conditions. I think that if we have a conversation and that becomes part of what we talk about as far as corporate repentance, that's fine. I am opposed to imposing reparations because I think that is what we call a conversation killer if we did that. So that's how I would approach that sort of idea. But yeah, I think that's just, we just need to throw it on the table. There's been a historical sin. What are we going to do to try to make up for that? What are we going to do that and what it may mean is, we look at certain types of affirmative action programs. It may mean that we look at ways to give opportunities to people of color. One thing the military has done is interesting. What they do is they take everyone cross race, and then they sort of train you up regardless of race. And then they say, okay, now you all compete. What they don't do is say, well, we're going to take you and we're just throwing in the military. We don't care what you came from. If you didn't have advantages, too bad. You just have to compete against this person had all these advantages. The military has basically said, no, we're going to make sure everyone is leveled up. And then once you're leveled up, and then you're going to compete. Is that the solution? It's worth talking about. I think that we should talk about it and figure out how we're going to move together in that. So I just want to throw the idea out there without offering concrete solutions.
Great. I think we're going to do probably two more questions. This one is also from, we've got a lot of questions. And so sorry if we don't get to all your questions, but one of them, it's another question. I really like this question. This is also from one of our elders, Matt. And he says, why mutual accountability rather than mutual sacrifice? Jesus modeled a posture of sacrificially surrendering power, like Philippians 2. Does mutual responsibility sacrifice require the individual with more power to submit first?
I'm not opposed in this conversation of having a policy of whites having to engage in the listening first. I do believe that everyone has to listen. So I'm not, I'm not backing away from that in the slightest. And so I'm not opposed to that. Mutual sacrifice, I guess I could have named it that. I guess my problem with that is, I think that gives the impression that the sacrifices are going to be equal. I don't think in the actual answers they are going to be. I don't think we're going to have equal sacrifices. I think the accountability to conversation is mutual. I do think that we have equal responsibility to engage in the conversation and engage in the conversation in a productive way, in a collaborative way, rather than in a way where we're trying to dominate the other individuals. So I would say that part of it. And so I guess I'm not going to say that I thought about sacrifice and I came to this rational conclusion and then because I didn't think about it in that way. But as I think about it, I don't think that that's what I would use. I think I like accountability because it puts the mutual part more on the front end of the conversation rather than the back end of the conversation. Get where I'm coming from. I think we're saying mutual sacrifice. The idea is that at the end, we're all gonna make the exact same sacrifice. And I can't know 100% for sure until we actually have these conversations and we actually engage in this. But my suspicion is that when we come to our solution, if we actually looked at it because of our history of abuse, that to create a more equitable solution, that whites are probably gonna make more of a sacrifice than people of color. Which I think is ironic because I think the anti-racism approach is, making sure that whites make this total sacrifice and people of color make little to none. But I think in the approach they've done it, they've generated a backlash to where whites can easily rationalize not making any sacrifice because of some of the rhetoric that comes out of the anti-racism movement. So I think that the approach I'm talking about will actually produce more of that, maybe not in the exact same ways of anti-racism, but will do so in a way where we all are in it together rather than one group imposing its ideas on another.
Great. All right. Maybe our last question from our brother Jim Knight. Jim is a head of school at a phenomenal private Christian school here in Santa Monica, does a fantastic job. He says that he has Black families in his school that do not want him to look at their race, and he has other families that do want him to consider their race. What do I do? He says.
Yeah, I ran into this when I did research on Christian college campuses, because the assumption is, hey, you're Black, we know how you think. But yeah, I found that there were some people of color, Blacks, Latinx, and Asians, who went to schools and they said, look, we gave them questionnaires and open-ended questions. And they said, look, I went here to get an education. I went here to learn about, my faith. I went here, don't bring this Black History Month stuff to me. Don't bring, this race stuff. That's not what I'm here for. And so, African Americans are not a monolithic group of people. There are people, who, I tell people, no Black person speaks for me. I speak for me. I know my Black experience. Only I truly understand my Black experience. Other African Americans have an understanding of the Black experience, and so they may be closer to it, but only I understand my Black experience. And so we can't be looking for any African American to speak for all African Americans. That's just, I don't claim to speak for anyone but myself. And so on. So I guess to answer the question in that sense is that, to the ones who don't want race brought in, don't bring race in. To the ones who do bring race in. Now, what that means is, the problem is if you're in front of the whole class, what do you do? Or you have a school assembly, what do you do? And that becomes more of the challenge. I think, not being an educator in that sort of setting, I think, you will try to bring it in a qualified way. Not as much, you probably have to bring it in more than the people who don't want it at all and less than people who want it more. That's probably the fairest way you're going to be able to do it to meet as many needs as possible. And so, I'll try to bring it in a more qualified way, give some sort of qualifier before bringing some stuff in, or maybe creating spaces or courses where those who want race more, they can go in those courses and have it, and those who don't have to. Because, I don't think there's anything gained by forcing a person of color to engage racially when he or she doesn't want to engage racially. I think that, we have agency too. So that's just off the top of my head how you try to do that. Obviously, as individuals, you can accommodate each individual. But yeah, I think that you'll just have to juggle it when it comes to the educational setting where in a school assembly or something like that. That'd be my best guess.
Well, we have waded into challenging territory tonight. And as a church, again, we start off by saying we want to be able to discern the times, and we want to be able to respond to the challenges that are facing our culture in Christian ways. I have one last question for you. It's a little more lighthearted. It's probably a good place to end. It's from our brother, Shane Harris. He wants to know, is Oklahoma better at football than Texas?
You know, every now and then the refs help them to cheat and then they win. But, you know, so every now and then they might be better. But here's the thing. That's the only thing they're good at. I mean, why else would you go to Oklahoma? You know, what would be the purpose of going to Oklahoma except maybe to play football? I mean, there's no other. Have you ever been to Oklahoma? You know what I'm talking about. I mean, you just would.
Maybe we'll have the two of you do
It's
some
one of the
active
things that when
listening.
you drive through there, you want to drive through as fast as you can and get through it. You know, it's not I'm scared of being jumped on by wives. It's Oklahoma. So that's so when we beat them in football, it's really a sad thing when we do beat them because then they got nothing. They can't even claim football that year. So that really is it's horrible when that happens. I mean, you don't want to be around Oklahomans when we do beat them in football.
Dr. Yancey, so before we end our evening tonight, how can people kind of engage with your work? How can people kind of find you, you know, and interact with your work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, there's the books. I am on Facebook and Twitter. I do blog, Shattering Paradigms. I don't just talk about race, although I talk about race more and more since all this has happened. I also talk about my anti-Christian stuff. So, you know, so those are some of the things that can happen. If, you know, if any of y'all are, have or know people in college who might want to do research on stuff like this, Waco is not that bad of a place to be. Let me just say that, you know, you know, you can work under me. You know, we can talk about that. So those are some of the things that happened. But yeah, I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and so if you want to look me up, that's fine.
And if people have more questions or they wanted to, you know, interact with you or have got some follow-up stuff, can we create a way to be able to get you some of those questions? Maybe you can get back to some people for stuff we
Sure,
couldn't
I
get
mean,
to.
you have my email, so
Yeah.
I'd be happy to answer questions. Or if people could contact me on Facebook or Twitter, you know, they can ask me directly.
Okay, we'll do that. Well, Dr. Yancey, again, I can't thank you enough for taking time out to be with us as a church. You know, challenging topics, and I hope that we as a church, I mean, I'm just going to say this to the church, if they're still, for those who are still listening, the homework that Dr. Yancey has given us is so important because, like, I will reemphasize this. I have a real strong sense of some of your all's really strong opinions, but you all don't necessarily have a sense of each other's, or you kind of maybe see the worst of those things on social media. So, you know, I'd love to help you. We as elders would love to help you be able to connect to other people in the church who maybe see things differently, think about things differently, and really begin to practice active listening and practice understanding one another. Because for us as a church, we don't want this to be just a thing that we kind of mention when there's an explosion. We want to be a church that really kind of helps, again, like I said, engage with the world on this issue in a far more Christian and faithful way. So all of you who are part of our church, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And again, thank you, Dr. Yancey. I know that our church would applaud and if they could, but they're all muted, so that won't happen. And maybe you can see some of them here. But thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll see you Sunday morning as we continue our series on how to be the church together. So thank you, everybody. Good night.
God bless you all.